The meeting come to order. We're fixing to begin a special call meeting of the Independent School Board of Trustees. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2020. Time is 6 o'clock p.m.
For board training, right?
Yes. Just notes to the public, video conferencing pursuant to government admin temporary suspension, open meetings law issued March 16, 2020 to advance the public health goals of limited face-to-face meetings, also social distances. This meeting will be conducted via video conferencing, which will be audible to the board and public to allow for a two-way communication. We'll determine quorum present. Let the record reflect that Ms. Rafael Yanez, Rafi Ayala, Ms. Jamie Whitwell, Thomas Schillers, and myself, Dionisio Ramirez, are present at the library at Franklin Middle School, and Ms. Kim Hall and Mr. Scott Reese are video conference. They're also present. We'll begin with the prayer box, please.
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we are thankful to be able to be here today. Lord, we ask you, Lord, to be in our presence. We ask you to be with us as we take care of the business of the school today. And Lord, just everything that we say and do will be to thy honor and glory. Father, we also come before you tonight with a petition upon our hearts. We know that your word says where two or three are gathered, you are there. Father, we are asking for your healing hand upon one of our students tonight, on Mason Reyes. Father, that you will heal him and Father, that he will be made whole. And we know in our hearts and believe that you will. Father, guide and direct us during our meeting here. Keep everyone safe as they leave this place as well. Father, just guide every step that we take. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
First, I'll get this citizens' comments. Dr. Shields, do we have any citizens' comments?
We have two citizens' comments. Would you like me to read them now?
Yes, sir, please.
Okay. The first is from Christina Yanez. She asks, is it possible for staff members that have no child care options to remain at home, teach remotely, and care for our children? Will we be given the option to do so? Second question is from Valerie Rodriguez, who says, my concern is in regards to teachers who have school-age children and younger who are expected to return to work without adequate child care in town. How will they be able to return to work without having a place to safely leave their own children? Those are the two comments.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. Board will not engage with discussion with the speaker during any agenda item during citizen comments, but we'll receive the information only. Thank you all for those concerns. We'll go to our action items. Item on agenda is item A, training on family first coronavirus act, FFCRA.
Okay. We have with us Jennifer Hall, who is an attorney with our law firm of Walsh Gallegos, and she is an expert in the FFCRA rules and will be able to provide training. We are getting more training credit for this training this evening. And thank you, Ms. Hall, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Turn it over to you.
Okay. And I'm going to start by asking if you have any questions at any point during this training. I can see two people on my screen that are also remote. I can't really see, other than Dr. Seals, anybody in the audience. So I don't know if Jeanette, you want to, if you're on your computer too, if you want to shoot me a chat that they're there, or if you all just want to speak up, and I will try my best to answer the questions as they come up. Like Dr. Shields said, I'm Jenny Hall. I've been a school lawyer for about 22 years. I'm with Walsh Gallegos, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the FFCRA, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And if you can't see the slides or if there's anything, please let me know that, because this is a unique way to do an in-service, I will say. So the FFCRA was passed April 1st, and it will expire on December 31st of 2020 unless it is extended. For that reason, we aren't really recommending a whole lot of policy changes, because if you remember, policy is supposed to kind of live and grow with the school. And this is just too short a period of time. So most of the actions that you will take with respect to the FFCRA will be done through resolutions or just board action, as opposed to an amendment to your policy. The FFCRA addresses two separate types of leave that it offers to employees. The first is it expands what has traditionally been known as the Family and Medical Leave Act, and then it provides for what they call emergency paid sick leave. So let's talk first about what I'm going to call the EFML. Is it the same as the traditional FML that we have all grown to know and love? You're going to love this. It is a yes and no answer. So it is in that it applies to all public employers, including school districts. Unfortunately, you will have heard that the FFCRA and the CARES Act provide tax credits for some of this work. Unfortunately, they don't provide the tax credits to governmental entities. That's only going to be applied to private businesses. An employee is eligible for FMLA, for the EFML, after they've worked for you for 30 days. And this is a look back period from the day that the employee requests the leave. If they've been with you 30 days, then they qualify. This is very different from the FML, right? Traditional FML, you have to have worked for a year for 1,250 hours in the last year to be eligible. That is not what they have applied to the EFML. You only have to work for the district for 30 days. So we've already talked that it is sort of like the FML, but not really. It is a subpart, and the way that it is similar, if you remember, under the FML, an employee gets a total of 12 weeks, right, to take leave under the FML. The EFML and the FML work together so that the employee is only entitled to a total of 12 weeks for both leaves. So let me give you an example. If I am a teacher and last year I had my baby in October, right? So I took FML October, November, December, and I was supposed to come back in January, and I did. And then in March, COVID hits and the schools, let's say the schools hadn't shut down, but let's say at that point, I ask you for EFML to take care of my child, right? As the school district, we would have to say, no, you're not eligible for EFML because you've already taken your 12 weeks of FML when you stayed home to care for your baby. So total, the employee will get 12 weeks for both leaves total together. And the EFML can only be used to take care of your son or daughter whose place of care or school is closed or inaccessible due to COVID-19. Okay, so in that same analysis that I gave you with the pregnant teacher who has a baby, if the teacher comes to you and says, my baby's daycare has closed because of COVID, in that situation, and let's say that was a bad example. Let me give you a teacher who's got like a 2-year-old, so they are still good with their FML. And they say, my child's daycare is closed because of COVID. So under this leave, that we would process that, your district HR team, and they would give her 12 weeks. The first 2 weeks of that would be unpaid. The remaining 10 weeks would be paid at 2/3 leave. However, if the same teacher came to you and said, my child suffers from asthma, and because of that, she can't go to school, under that case, the school is not closed. So the teacher would not be eligible for EFML. Does that distinction make sense? Technically, the schools absolutely have to be closed. It has to be like what was going on in the spring. They cannot be open at all for a teacher to qualify for this leave. Okay. So the Expanded Family Medical Leave Act gives somebody 12 weeks to take care of their child if the school is closed or daycare is unavailable. As I said before, the first 2 weeks are unpaid, and the remaining 10 weeks are paid at 2/3 the employee's regular rate, up to a cap of $200 per day. And FML is only going to be a factor in whether or not, how many weeks the employee gets, not whether or not they get it, right? As long as they've been there 30 days, they should qualify. Now, I want you to remember that under this, the first 2 weeks are unpaid, and you will see why that is. Under this leave, under the EFML, what are the options available to the school district? Okay, especially in requesting types of documentation, right? Because what the statute says is it works a lot like FML in that the employee can call the school and say, I can't come in right now because of this. And after the fact, the teacher can provide the documentation. So what kind of documentation are we looking for? The employee is going to have to certify that they are the only person that can take care of their child, right? There's no spouse, or the spouse is working. There's no grandparent. There is no one else available to take care of your child while the school is closed other than you. The second thing that we get to ask about is, how old is your child? Because the way the statute is written, it is available for any child under the age of 18. However, for private industry where they are getting to take the tax credit, the IRS has opined that children 14 years old, 14 or older, should be able to stay by themselves during a daytime hour, during the daytime hours. And so they have opined that for those kids, parents should provide written document. Excuse me?
Excuse me, someone's speaking. They're not muted. Hold on. Okay. Is it on the YouTube channel? Because you're zooming, right? I'm zooming. Okay. I'll look for it. Can you mute your mic, please?
Sorry.
Okay, Jenny, I'm sorry. You can go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'm sorry. So for this leave, they have said that in the statute, it says 18 years old or younger, right? But the IRS has said if your child is 14 years old or older, they should be able to stay by themselves during daylight hours. And therefore, employer, you are able to ask for documentation as to what the reason is that your child can't stay home by themselves during daylight hours. Now, if you've got a 14-year-old and a 2-year-old, that kind of goes out the window, and you know the 2-year-old is going to take precedence. But if you only have one child and he's 14 or 16, you can ask the employee for documentation for a reason why that child cannot take care of themselves during daylight hours. So let's talk about the second part of the leave, which is the emergency paid sick leave. Like the EFML, this is going to also apply to public school districts, to public employers. However, unlike the EFML, there is no requirement that an employee work for a certain amount of time before they qualify. Remember, under the EFML, the teacher or the employee had to be with you for 30 days, and it was a look back. Under this, employees are eligible the very first day they begin work for you. And it also applies to substitute teachers as part-time employees. So all part-time employees and all full-time employees will be eligible for EPSL. Now, the caveat to that is this leave only applies when there is work available to be performed, but the employee is unable to work or telework. Okay. So an example of this would be, and I know that this didn't happen a whole lot in the spring, but if you were a substitute teacher in the spring and we closed instruction to in-person instruction, so we were only hiring teachers to work virtually, right? Teachers were working from home. There wasn't really a great need for substitutes. In that situation, a substitute would not have qualified for EPSL because there would not have been work available for them to do. That is the first key in whether or not an employee is eligible for this. So what does the EPSL give them and how do you get it? Okay. It gives an employee up to 80 hours, which is roughly 10 days of paid sick leave that they can take. And they can take it for one of, and you'll see I have 6 reasons listed, but the 6th one doesn't exist. So for your purposes right now, they can take it for reasons 1 through 5. Which are, they are subject to a quarantine or isolation order under COVID-19. Generally, Governor Abbott's orders will not qualify an employee for this leave. Number 2, they have been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine because of COVID, right? So this is where you're seeing individuals who are diabetic, who are immunosuppressed. You've seen the list, it's floating around. They smoke, they have COPD, all of these reasons that put them in a higher risk category. Their doctor, if their doctor provides them written documentation that they are at a greater risk, that may qualify them for EPSL. Number 3, the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID and is seeking a medical diagnosis. That becomes very important, right? The employee has to seek a medical diagnosis. So in the early days of COVID, in the spring, when people were symptomatic, they were told, go home. We don't have enough tests for you. Do you remember? And you only go to the doctor if you're really, really bad, and then you go to the hospital. So all of those teachers or employees that would have gone home feeling that they had COVID, but they couldn't get a test and they couldn't get into their doctor, technically would not have qualified for EPSL because they were not seeking a medical diagnosis. The 4th reason is to care for an individual subject to or advised to quarantine or isolate. This is if you have to care for your spouse or a child or a sick parent or whatever. And number 5 is caring for a son or daughter whose school or place of care is closed or whose child care provider is unavailable. That should sound very familiar to you, right? That was the EFML. That's how you get the 12 weeks of leave. So they're covering it. The reason the first 2 weeks of that are unpaid under the EFML is because they get paid by the EPSL. So those 2 leaves run concurrently. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Ms. Hall.
Yes, sir.
Back to number 3.
Yes, sir.
Experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis.
Yes, sir.
If someone comes up here and they're running a temperature, public teacher, for example, running a temperature, we say, you got to go home.
Right.
And they say, well, okay, I'm gone. And then they wait 6 or 7 days before they decide to go get tested. Can we say, go straight and get tested right now? Do we have any authority to be able to tell them to do that?
You can. You don't really have any authority, but here's the problem on the back end, right? If the teacher takes 6 days and tests positive, under the way the language of the statute is written, they don't have to provide you documentation on the day they go out. So they could take those 6 days and give you the documentation on the 6th day, and you would just retroactively credit it. The same way you do with FML currently.
You broke up.
Oh, so an employee can go on the 6th day and get tested. The statute does not require them to provide you medical documentation at the front end. It allows them to provide you medical documentation at any time. So if they go on the 6th day and they test positive and they provide you with that information, then you retroactively count them those 6 days. So if you had been counting them absent under their leave, you would just credit them that and then give them the EPSL. Does that make sense? Because they can provide you that notification at any time.
And what if they refuse to go and they just stay home for 2 or 3 days and say, "Oh, I'm well"?
Well, that's on their nickel. That's on their leave days. And then TEA has put out what defines close contact, which is you have been in the same room less than 6 feet for more than 15 minutes with no mask. And if that is the case, then depending on whether you are symptomatic or asymptomatic, you have to stay home for 10 to 14 days. And that's by guidance from TEA. So
there's only one 10-day period that is paid, correct?
Correct. This is a one-time bite at the apple. Once you've used it, you lose it. And if you don't use it by December 31st, unless they expand it, it goes away.
And the EFML, I can see a situation where I'm teaching math or something, and one of my kids, and I'm doing in-person instruction, one of my kids comes down with a COVID. So the class has to be sent home.
Not technically. No.
Okay, tell me what technically.
So technically the individual, so if the kid has a cold, they may or may not have a fever, but let's go off the assumption that they do have a fever and they do test positive. Then if the child was not wearing a mask, and you were less than 6 feet, that's when you start to send them home individually.
Tell me what you just said again.
Okay. And I think, don't quote me on this, but my understanding from a reliable source is that the commissioner is supposed to come out with more guidance on that this week. But my understanding is that if you are a sick kid, right? Kid is sick. If the kid has come to school sick, right, which they failed to do the attestations that the parents are supposed to do before they send the kid to school, but the kid comes to school and then starts to show symptoms, you isolate that child immediately. If the child is not wearing a mask, then yes, you have a problem. But if the child is wearing a mask, has not been less than 6 feet, that's when you start to have problems. If they are 6 feet, you should be okay. And in that case, you isolate who they've dealt with, and that's who you start to send home. You don't necessarily have to send home the whole cohort.
But then you have to notify all the parents in the class.
Yes. Oh, yes. You have to notify all the parents, all the teachers, and all the staff. Yes.
In the whole school or in that class?
In the whole school is the way TEA's got it written right now. And so we've been talking with some of our clients because we really do believe you're going to end up sending home a letter every single day. And so instead of sending 15 letters home in one day, right? You send one letter saying we've had 15 incidences today. We've had 2 on Tuesday. We've had 3 on Wednesday. Yes, sir.
But the TEA guidance also talks about 15 minutes worth of contact.
Yes, without a mask and less than 6 feet apart. They're all ands.
Which is the life of a teacher.
Yeah.
And so.
But hopefully the teacher and or the students is wearing a mask, right? If the
teacher's wearing a mask, the deal's off, or is it the student has to wear the mask?
Well, right now we went around that today. It's written that the person who is exposed was not wearing the mask. Does that make sense? So it's a little different. They keep saying that the reason you wear a mask is to protect everybody else, but the way TEA guidance is written, you wear the mask to protect yourself, and that's what keeps you out of quarantine. It's kind of written in the reverse.
And so the 15 minutes is all day.
Cumulative total of 15 minutes. Yeah. So if you're in a classroom and you're cohorting these kids, you're more than likely going to hit the 15-minute for sure. And then you look at, were they less than 6 feet and did they not wear a mask?
So if I'm a teacher, I am likely to become exposed multiple times during the semester. And so here I am on September 12th. Well, that's probably a Sunday, but I'm going to play like it's a Wednesday. September the 12th, and I'm around these kids, and all of a sudden the next day one of them's absent, and then I hear that they've got the COVID. So I have to go home for 14 days. Is that correct?
Let me pull my charts, but not technically. I mean, again, I think you've got to meet the definition of close contact. And out of all of that guidance that TEA gave us, that was the best piece of that definition is the best thing they gave us. Because under that definition, if the teacher's wearing her mask all day when she's around that kid, she doesn't have to go home. It's only if she took it off and was less than 6 feet for more than 15 minutes with that one particular child. Does that make sense? So you've got to really cling to your definition of what is close contact. So if an employee is in close contact, right, more than 15 minutes, less than 6 feet, no mask, and they have had exposure, if they don't test and they don't develop symptoms, they have to go home for 14 days. If they test and get a negative test result and have no symptoms, they still have to wait 14 days. If they start to develop symptoms or they test positive, then they have to stay home for 72 hours without fever, with no medicine, right? Fever without Advil or whatever. Improved symptoms, and 10 days from the time the symptoms first appeared or from their positive test. So they could be home 10 days, they could be home 14 days, they could be home 16 days. It just depends on how long it takes for them to meet all three of those requirements under TEA's guidance.
Okay, so I've stayed home once. I come back the following month, same thing happens. My point that I'm trying to get you to talk about is intermittent leave. Am I going to be able to take this EFML on an intermittent basis?
That's a decision that the board has to make. So why don't we talk about it in the presentation, and then we can talk about it in closed session, and I could advise them on the pros and cons of that.
Okay.
Ms. Hall, I have one question. This is Kim Hoff here.
Hi, Ms. Hoff.
Hi, how are you doing? You're emphasizing the mask, as long as they're wearing the mask.
Right.
Is a face shield
Yes.
sufficient as well?
According to TEA, yes, ma'am. A face
Okay,
shield or a mask they're interchangeable.
I wanted to double check. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for pointing that out.
Ms. Hall.
Yes, ma'am.
This is Jamie Whitwell. I have a question as well, if you don't mind. It
Sure.
goes to the EFML. You said that there has to be documentation presented for teachers to stay home, and you said they have to certify there is no other person that can take care of the child. Tell me what that looks like to certify that they have no other child care.
It's just an attestation. And so the district form that we've created for you all has the teacher sign on the bottom that they're the only person that can take care of the child, that there's no one else that can.
Okay, they don't have to produce any kind of documents of any sort.
No, ma'am, they don't. So I want to just point out that when you're looking at this slide, number 6, you should just put a line through it. Because it says is experiencing substantially similar conditions as specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretary of Labor and Treasury, and they have not ever created anything that would have substantially similar circumstances. So that really doesn't exist at all. But I would be remiss if I didn't point it out to you on the off chance that in the next 6 months they decide to develop something else. But that one will not exist. I want to talk a little bit about these because what we're also seeing is a lot of teachers who are saying, I'm scared. I am scared. And the DOL, the Department of Labor, says in their questionnaires interpreting this law that fear is not a reason that you would qualify. Fear doesn't get you any leave. We understand that you're afraid and we are sorry, but it doesn't get you any leave. And then I wanted to just point out again that a lot of the shelter in place, a lot of people have thought that the shelter in place orders that have been put out by certain counties or by the governor would get you there, but they have not. So as of yet, they have not. That alone doesn't get you there. You still have to have work that you can be doing either at home or at work. Okay, moving on. So how much leave, if you'll remember, I said that part-time and full-time people are eligible for this. If you are full-time, you are eligible for up to 80 hours, which roughly equates to 10 days, right? It's about 8 hours a day. If you are part-time, they calculate it one of three ways. If you have known and regular hours, so right, you're maybe some school districts use substitute pools and they guarantee substitutes, I don't know, 15 hours a week. Then you're going to be eligible for EPSL based on the average number of hours you work in a 2-week period. So if you work 15 hours a week, you're guaranteed 30 hours. And so you will get, 15 hours. That's the average of 30 hours for the 2 weeks. If your hours are variable and unknown, right? So you're just a regular substitute and you could work 20 days in 1 month and 2 days in the next month, then you're going to be eligible for EPSL based on the average number of hours that you work in a 6-month period. So that means the district is going to have to pull their time cards for what they've paid you and calculate the average of how much you worked over a 6-month period.
When does this 6-month period start and end?
When they ask. So look back also.
So if it starts August the 10th, so it's 6 months back from August 10th?
Yep.
Which puts it when?
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, February, March, April, May, June, July. Yeah, February is 6 months.
Okay.
So they will not have, so that's a catch-22, right? Because they worked February, they worked half of March. They didn't work the end of March, April, May, June, July, or August.
Yeah, get to this. Our district chose to pay them the substitutes on the basically the last 3 months average that they worked before we shut down in March. And so is it days worked or is it paid? Because you said what they paid, what they
It's
got.
what they worked, but I have a feeling in that situation, you're going to have to use probably the same numbers you used for this. Because the other part of that is there is a discussion in the regulations about reduced hours. When you reduce someone's hours under the EPSL, you pay them for what their full hours were, not for what the reduced hours are. So I'm under what you've told me right now, my answer for you would probably be that you would pay them what you had been paying them. The estimate of the 3 months is what they would be, that's what they would be characterized as.
Even though they didn't work.
Even though they didn't work. It's the same with reduced hours. If you schedule me for 40 hours and then because of COVID, you reduce me to 10 hours a week, you're still going to have to pay me EPSL at 40 hours a week, whether I worked it or not.
Now, if we've got substitutes that we're going to be paying some number of dollars to, and can we require them to come in and help in other areas besides substitutes to make those hours productive for the school district?
Yes, but you can't count it as EPSL if you do that. If they are on EPSL, they are on leave. There's no work for them to do. So if you want them to do that, then you would give them remote work and they would work from home and there would be no need to pay them for the extended paid sick leave. And then if the employee hasn't worked in 6 months, they haven't worked for you for 6 months. Say their first job for you was at the end of January and they're coming back now in, September, October. Then you would use the hours based on what you kind of agreed upon when the employee was hired. So, that's at your discretion. I don't know when you hire substitutes if you say, on average, we usually hire you 3 times a month or how that works. So,
No, we don't do that. We just, use them when we need them.
you need them. So they may not be eligible because you may not have guaranteed them anything. If there's one slide I would ask you to, as you're making these decisions, keep at your desk, it's this one. I think this one illustrates really well the distinctions in the EPSL, right? And so if you will see, the first 3 reasons generally deal with self, right? The employee is subject to quarantine or isolation. The employee is advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, or the employee is seeking medical diagnosis and experiencing symptoms. And so because it deals with the employee themselves, they are going to get 100% of their daily rate up to a cap of $511. That's for the 80 hours or the 10 days. If it's reasons 4 through 6, which doesn't exist, 4 and 5, they're caring for someone else. And so for that reason, they're only going to get 2/3 of their daily rate up to a cap of $200 a day. And so this slide to me in a nutshell is really what the gist of the EPSL is. And what that kind of looks like is if you're getting 100% of your daily rate up to a maximum of $511, that totals out at $5,110 for the 80 hours. And if you're working, if you're doing reasons 4 through 6, where you're getting 2/3 of your daily rate up to $200, that caps out at $2,000 for all 80 hours for the 10 days. Any questions on that? Now, I will say there are some, and this is part of what we'll talk about in closed session, and I actually may have another slide on it, but while I'm here, I wanted to address it. There are some employees who may say, I don't want to take EPSL. I have enough accrued leave, and my daily rate is higher than either $511 or $200. And so I don't want to take my EPSL. I want to use my accrued paid leave. And that is a decision that the employee makes. Different from the decisions you and I will talk about in closed session later. Whether or not the employee takes EPSL or takes their own accrued leave is their decision to make. And there are some that are going to say it's just not financially feasible. I'm better off taking my accrued leave than I am using your EPSL. And that's okay. So let's talk a little bit about the types of documentation that we need for both EPSL and EFML. And we've talked about that a little bit already. But this is what I was alluding to. For both types of leave, the Department of Labor has said that oral notice is sufficient. So them just calling HR and saying, I'm sick, my kid's sick, I've got to take care of my husband, our school is closed, all of that should be fine until such time as they can give you written notice. And so that's why we've kind of put into the form different requirements for documentation, and or if they can't give you the documentation, that they will give you their name and contact information of their doctor and authorize you to reach out. So for each leave request, obviously you need the employee's name, the date of their requested leave so that you can calculate how long they're going to be out and when they should return, the reason for the leave, the dates, if like for EFML, where the employee would know, hey, the school is closed from August 17th to September 7th, right? They can give you those dates, beginning and end. A statement that the employee signs affirming that they are unable to work or telework for the requested reason. And part of this is, I think it gets lost sometimes as I've been working on this for a while. This leave is to be given if the employee can't work from home. So in situations where the employee can work from home, that's kind of what you address first, is how do we make working from home work? If for certain positions, like arguably a teacher, where if you have a class full of kids, you actually need a teacher there to maintain discipline and to teach. So maybe being present is a function of their job, and so they can't work from home. So those are kinds of things that we're going to talk about, that you're going to have to kind of explore with your superintendent and your HR department. But theoretically, you should be giving the employee, if there is work available to do from home or from a remote location, that would be the first, I guess, line of defense. And then again, the statement that the employee signs affirming they're the only individual that can take care of their child. If they're home for a isolation order or a quarantine order from a governmental entity, they need to provide you a copy of that. If it's been published in the newspaper or something, they can print that and bring you that. If the leave is because a doctor has told them they need leave, then they need to give you a copy of the order if they can. And if they can't, they need to give you the doctor's name, contact information, and written authorization that you can reach out to their doctor. We talked about if the leave is because the school is closed, you get the affirmation that they're the only parent that can take care of the kid. And you get written documentation if the child is over 14, if you decide to go that route, as to why the child can't stay home by themselves. If it's a daycare, then you get something from the daycare that says we're closed. Or if they've published some kind of notice, you can use that as well. And so I want to talk about a situation where the employee would be taking care of themselves, right? Let's use the example of an employee who gets COVID, God forbid, gets COVID, tests positive, and at least what I've been seeing in the news, oftentimes it doesn't resolve itself in the 2 weeks that you get under EPSL, right? So the employee takes the 2 weeks of EPSL, still can't come back. In that case, they would if they assume they qualify for traditional FML. So you have to look, have they met the 1250-hour requirement? Have they exhausted it yet? Because if they have, they can't use it. If they haven't, then you would put them on FML. You would run it concurrently with any accrued leave, just like you normally do. And that's the path you would go, right? The only time, again, that they get the EFML is if the school is closed. Otherwise, they're taking the 2 weeks of EPSL, and then they're either having to use their accrued leave or FML or TDL, any one of those types of leave that they are afforded under the law. Any questions about that?
Yes.
Okay.
Following that line of thinking, and if I'm a teacher, and back to the scenario we had earlier, and I got sent home because I was exposed, or even if I got a case and I've got a light case of COVID, I, can still function. If the district chooses, and I'm on this EFL, can I change it to remote instruction? If I can remote instruct from home and save some of my EFL for later in case I get sick again, or I get sent home again. Are we going to talk about that later?
Yep.
Okay. I can see the look on your face.
As I'm concentrating, I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah, we'll talk about that in closed session for sure. Okay. Let's see. We talked about those. So using the EFML and the EPSL together. As we talked about earlier, it's not a coincidence that the first 2 weeks of EFML are unpaid. And the intent was that the 80 hours of EPSL would run concurrently with the EFML to guarantee the employee 12 weeks of pay at 2/3 rate. But remember, it is the employee's choice whether they run those leaves concurrently and whether they take EPSL at all. Okay. The EPSL is only 80 hours. This is what we talked about a minute ago. So if the employee himself gets sick, or God forbid, say I'm the teacher and my husband gets sick, and I have to stay home to take care of my husband, right? So I get, again, the 80 hours of EPSL, but then I have to see if I qualify for traditional FML, because remember, you can take FML to care for yourself or someone that is in your immediate family. And so again, I have to look at, have I worked 1250 hours in a 12-month period? And if I have, then I'm still only eligible for a total of 12 weeks. So you would run the EPSL, the 2 weeks paid EPSL, concurrently with the 12 weeks of FML. So you would get 2 weeks of that paid. And then after the 2 weeks of EPSL, you'd still have 10 weeks left of FML, and you would run your accrued leave concurrently with that for as long as it lasts. And then when you run out of that, then FML becomes unpaid. Remember that FML is unpaid. All right. Now, this is one of the decisions we'll get to make in closed session. I make it sound so exciting. We'll get to make it in closed session. You all will get to make in closed session, but whether or not you allow accrued leave to run for the EPSL that is at 2/3 rate, right? So 2/3 rate is not an employee's full daily rate. And what the law has said is that the employee, if the employee has accrued paid leave, right, and most employees get 10 state and local days a year. So if the employer agrees and the employee desires, then you can run it concurrently. So basically, you guys have to decide to allow it, and the employee has to ask for it. You can still offer it, but they don't have to take it. And what they would be doing is using their accrued paid leave to supplement the 2/3 paid leave. So they would use a third of their accrued paid leave to meet up to the 2/3 to make 100% of their daily rate. And they would do that for as long as they could. Now, what the law says is that you have to do it in the smallest increment possible. And this sounds like a great idea sometimes, but it is very hard. What we've heard from a lot of school districts is that it's very complicated for payroll. Depending on what payroll system you use, it may or may not be able to capture this. And then if it does, it may only be able to do it in full day increments, which is not what the law would say you needed to use it in, right? The smallest increment you can use generally is a half day. At some places it's an hour. So those are all things to think about if this is something that once we're in closed session, you all talk about and come out and vote on and decide it's something you want to do. Obviously work with your school attorneys. This stuff is complicated. It really is. You'll probably need to review your DEC just to make sure that what it says about how you record. I know most policies with respect to FML, especially intermittent FML traditionally, have been able to narrow it down to the 1 hour increment. Other school districts do different things. If you're a classroom teacher that's going to require a sub, they make you take half days. I mean, there's just a variety of ways that that this type of reduction of accrued leave gets calculated and counted. And so you just need to make sure that you're in line with that. And then obviously, like tonight, get board approval for whatever it is you're going to go forward with. So here's your slide, Dr. Seals. Intermittent leave and the EPSL, much like the accrued leave, right? Using accrued leave to supplement, employees are allowed to take, with board approval, are allowed to take intermittent leave for both the EPSL and the EFML. And so let me give you an example of this, right? Say that you, instead of Cotulla, say you live in San Antonio and you teach in San Antonio I.S.D, but your kids go to school in Schertz-Cibolo. And SAISD makes the decision that they're going to have in-person teaching, and Schertz-Cibolo makes the determination that it's all of their teaching is going to be virtual. So now you're the teacher in SAISD and you got to go to school and your kids are at home because their school is virtual. And so their school would technically be closed. So they would qualify for 10 weeks of 2/3 pay, right? Or 10 weeks of 2/3 pay under the EFML and 2 weeks unpaid under the, or vice versa, under the EPSL. And the teacher comes to you and says, my husband can take off Mondays and Thursdays, and he can stay with our kids Mondays and Thursdays, and I can work Mondays and Thursdays, but I have to have off Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So can I take this intermittently? If you all decide to do that, you can allow intermittent leave. A lot of school districts are concerned about the disruption in the classroom that intermittent leave brings. I will tell you the only way that a teacher can do intermittent leave if it is to care for a child. If you are in-person classroom, the only way you can do intermittent leave is if it's because your child's school is closed, because they're worried about the contamination, right? So if you're taking care of somebody who's sick, they don't want you coming in and out of a live classroom. So, but if you're virtual, then you can take intermittent leave for all of this. Does that make sense? So intermittent leave is an option that we're going to talk about in closed session if it's something that you all are interested in allowing. Any questions so far before I move on? Okay. Reporting to the work site, right? Which is what we're kind of trying to figure out if it's going to happen or not happen this fall. Like we just said, leave to care for a kid whose school is closed or childcare is unavailable. That is the only reason, if you are at the work site, you can take intermittent leave. And this is because of the low risk of infection. They don't want you to spread COVID or any other germs. And you can take, if you allow it, the employee can take the entire portion of EPSL or EFML intermittently. The only other way you can do it is if you are virtually or if you are working remotely. Then you can take it for the other reasons. And if an employee, so let's give a different, if you're doing intermittent leave, so generally they say if you're going to take EFML or EPSL, you have to take it all at one bite, right? So absent intermittent leave, if you're going to be out to take care of your kid, the school can force the employee to take all of it in one chunk. However, if you're doing intermittent leave and say you're halfway through your 12 weeks and schools reopen, then you can bank the remaining amount that you haven't used. And if schools close again, you can use it then up until December 31st. Remember, all of this goes away. It's like Cinderella. All of this goes away December 31st at midnight. So until then, they can use the leave that they haven't fully exhausted. And then working remotely will allow people to work. If you are all working remotely, then they are, and you allow it, they can work intermittently for any of those reasons. But again, it is complicated for your payroll, and you have to make sure that that payroll system can sustain the record keeping and the record keeping in the smallest increment possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any questions? That's the long and short of it.
Nobody got any questions? Nope.
No, sir.
Everybody's clear as mud or just kind of,
I'm gonna let you worry about it.
thanks. We advertised this, I think, for 7:30.
Do you have any questions on the quarantining or any of that while we're waiting?
On the quarantining, the county or the city cannot issue a quarantine, right? In other words, if they say schools are closed to the students, that's not a quarantine.
No, that's not a quarantine. You're correct. That's right. That's right. That's like what we had in the spring, and we just move forward day to day at home.
Dr. Sim, did she answer the question I texted you?
Yes. And so the only person or entity that can issue a quarantine is the health department or a physician or who?
Well, I think those are different types of quarantine, right? So a physician can tell an individual, you have COVID, you need to quarantine or isolate. Or they can tell an individual, you have a health condition that makes you more susceptible, you need to quarantine or isolate. And that's contemplated by number 2 in the EPSL. Number 1 contemplates more the orders that come down from the governor that are complete shelter in place, don't go out, don't go anywhere. Schools are closed, businesses are closed, everything's closed, you're staying inside. I think those are more governmental orders. Number 1 covers more governmental quarantines, where number 2 covers more medical quarantines from a doctor per individual.
Ms. Hall,
Yes, ma'am.
this is Kim Hoff. If they are working remotely and they are able to work, let's say they do catch COVID and it's a mild case, and our school is closed. Okay, school's closed. Everybody is working remotely. Some may be coming up to the classroom to record their lessons and work in classrooms, while others may be, due to lack of childcare, are working remotely. If they come down with COVID, if they can continue to work, there's no reason to file for a leave. Is that
That's right.
correct?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
It just becomes when they're too sick to work, that's when they would take it.
Is Paul gonna come back for our next meeting at 7:30?
This is Jamie Woodwell. I have a question. When you're talking about a quarantine, are you defining that as someone who's been tested positive or has been exposed, as opposed to a shelter in place, which could be ordered by the county?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's the quickest way the easiest way to describe them. Yes. Quarantines will be issued individually, shelter in place, isolation orders. Although I do think that what the county was issuing early on, at least up here, was called an isolation order. But generally, I feel like isolation orders and quarantine orders are going to be per individual, where shelter in place and those types of orders are going to be coming from the governor.
Well, I hear the word quarantine used quite a bit, and when I hear that, I think, well, you were exposed? No, I'm just staying at home to keep from getting sick. Well, that's not quarantine, sheltering in place, correct?
I'm sorry, it's real hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. I said I just hear the word quarantine being used on a regular basis, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean anyone was exposed. It just simply means that they are staying home for safety reasons.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. And I actually think if you want to get technical, I think quarantine probably does mean that they were exposed, and isolation means that they are staying home just to be safe. But, I think they're getting thrown around all the time interchangeably. So I'm not gonna nitpick on that, because I think that's the truth. If you're getting anything from a doctor, it's going to be called either a quarantine or an isolation order. At least the stuff I'm seeing is.
So if I'm quarantined, the authorities are gonna come around and nail something on my front door that says quarantine, do not enter, and, so everybody knows it, right?
Well, it's a funny thing that technically that's what's supposed to happen under Chapter 81 of the Health and Safety Code, right? That the health departments are using to close everybody down. They're supposed to send individual notice certified mail, but that hadn't really happened. So, it's kind of the Wild West right now with how that works. But I doubt anybody's going to nail anything on your door these days.
That would probably violate HIPAA orders.
Yeah, exactly. Or if you're a kid, FERPA or trespass orders, Lord knows.
Ms. Hall, I have a question. This is Robert Ayala.
Hello, Mr. Ayala.
So is it safe to say that an employee, let's just say an employee gets a mild case of COVID-19. Is it safe to say that the employee decides whether he or she can teach remotely from the house while in quarantine?
Yes. I think that's a fair assessment, because you are going to have some teachers and some employees, not just teachers. It's not fair of me to say teachers. Some employees who are going to say, I've got it, and I'm just gonna take my leave, and that's okay. We don't really get to question that, as long as they're giving us the medical documentation to support it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. And I would say there's kind of two schools of thought about that. Generally and historically, I think school districts have been more interested in allowing people to utilize the leave, and because it's one and done, right? Then they're gone, then the leave is gone, and then you don't have to worry so much about teacher coverage, substitutes, any of that stuff, as opposed to drawing it out over the course of the next, what are we, July, August, September, October, November, December, next 5 months, when you may or may not have kids in session. It's just kind of every school district's got a different take on that, whether they're encouraging the use of the leave so that it's gone, or whether they're trying to get their employees to kind of hold on to it just in case.
Cynthia had a question. Can she? Ms. Perkins.
Ms. Perkins, you want to ask your question?
Yes, I just typed it to Jeanette, but my question is, now all administration have been working all summer, but are everybody else, are they considered employees employed for 30 days, even though they haven't worked?
I think most school districts are going to consider them employees for 30 days because you've been paying them over the summer, even just the way that the payment works for them. So, yeah, I know administration's the only ones that have been in, but for all intents and purposes, I haven't heard of one school district who's going to play hardball with that. That's a really good question, by the way.
Well, I think our teachers have been Zooming quite a bit with their meetings and planning and all of that. So, yeah, thank you for mentioning that and answering that question, because they certainly should be considered.
Yeah. I mean, this is uncharted territory for everybody. And even, I've now had 2 friends who have had it. One of them got it and was done in 2 weeks. Fine, back to normal, no problem. The other one got a very mild case of it, and he's 7 weeks out, and he is getting symptoms every other day. He'll have a fever, or he'll have, then he'll be fine the next day. Then he'll wake up with conjunctivitis, just kind of, it affects people so differently. I think everybody's kind of in a guessing game on this one.
What are, Ms. Hall,
Yes, sir.
what are we not asking that we should be asking?
You know, I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of what you really want to ask me is, you know, the attorney-client privilege part of this that we'll do in closed session. It's kind of the more nitty-gritty. How does it apply to what we're wanting to do? How does it impact our decision daily? You know, what are the risks that we have from that? The leave itself, what we just went over, is pretty basic. It becomes more complicated as you apply it. And honestly, it becomes more complicated when you pair it with TEA's quarantining document, right? The health and safety document, because then, you know, there is only one bite at the apple, and so what happens at that point? So I think there's just unfortunately more to be discussed in closed session than there is in open session. But you know, if you guys have other questions about COVID, if you have questions about TEA's quarantine procedures for either students or administration, you know, I'm here.
Ms. Hall, I don't know if this is something that we're going to be mentioning and talking about in closed session. But if we're trying to kill time till 7:30, I do have a question, and if it's something we're discussing in closed session, just let me know and you can answer it there. But if we were considering, okay, our school's closed, and but some teachers are able to come in and use their classroom to have remote learning with the students.
Right.
Other teachers may feel and may have justification for lack of childcare and so forth, and so therefore they need to stay home and teach remotely from their home. Is it adequate to give just like a blanket coverage and say, for those staff members during closure, whether it be 4 weeks or whatever, however you choose to do it, whether you choose to do it remotely from your house or come into the school building and do it there, is it okay just to give them kind of free rein to make that decision until we make the decision, or until our county this order is null and void in our county, and we can open? And then at that point in time, you say, okay, we want everyone except for those that can do the attestation to say that they don't have the child care. That probably made no sense. Do you know what I'm asking?
I do know what you're asking. And I think I would feel more comfortable giving you some advice on that in closed session.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so don't forget the question, because
I won't.
I may.
Yeah. You want to close this one out?
Ms. Hall, if there's nothing else right now, can we take a break until 7:30 when our next meeting is scheduled?
Of course. Do you want me to recall in at 7:30?
I don't, or you can hang around and visit with us if you want.
Okay. Perfect.
Very good.
You want to close this one?
Yes, sir.
Entertain motion to adjourn, please. Move adjourn. I have a motion by Mr. Shoulders to adjourn. Second by Mr. Ayala. In discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign.